going to wait a few minutes and let some people get in. This picture is here to direct you in case you didn't know if you were in the right place. But let's see, we'll change it up here. This is Emily. I'm going to introduce her more formally in a second and have her introduce herself also because she knows more about what she does than I can tell you. And we're going to hear from her today. So 3 people on already. Awesome. We'll give it just another 10 or 15 seconds and then be a little more formal. Oh, let me give announcements actually. So you are on the YouTube live version and we're really excited you're here because you get to chat with us. You get to type into chat. It's not a specific YouTube login. It's actually a Google login. So you don't need a YouTube account. Google and YouTube are the same. So you can just type in your Google to sign in and then you can leave a comment. Do live comments. It does take 15 seconds for the comments to come to us. So be patient when they're happening. And we'll try to pause and leave enough time for that to happen. Let's see. So comment, please. We will work on that. Emily has some things she wants to talk about, but she's also very flexible and able to answer questions or direct the conversation the way that it makes sense for people who are on and listening. If you caught the end of this or you caught it later, you'll have the replay and that will be up forever. Please share this around just to people that have information. Our goal here, my goal, is to bring Emily to bring light to this idea of persistent primitive reflexes and how to integrate them and what it might mean for your child or even yourself as an adult if those are still present and how they can help. So, hello, Bonnie. All right, so let me stop the screen sharing because it's not actually necessary, and we will get started. So, Emily, welcome. I'm so glad that you're here. And let's see. So I just wanted to say a quick intro about Emily. I met Emily. No, let me say it different. I went to a talk at an Autism 1 conference about persistent primitive reflexes, and I got really excited about how that integrated in with what I do and the kids that I help. Not just autistic, right? But there's a whole spectrum of kids who need this, as you'll hear from Emily. And then I went online and saw if I knew someone in the area and found Emily's name. We met a few years ago for dinner or something and chatted a lot more and been connected ever since. So I'm very excited to have her on. Hello. I'm very excited to have her on and to talk about what she did. She has great schooling, which I can never keep straight in my brain. So I'm going to let her tell you about what she does, what her journey is, about where she came from, why she does what she does, why it's important, and, take it away. And I'll jump in with questions either that you guys have or things that I think of because my brain's excited. So go ahead, Emily. Thanks.
Okay, awesome. Well, so the formal introductions, I have a bachelor's degree in psychology. I am a certified midwife's assistant, so I've worked in midwifery care in both birth centers and home birth practices for a long time. And then I am also a certified a licensed neurodevelopmental delay therapist. And so that's what I do as far as working with the reflexes and the neurological stuff. I got my degree from a school called the Institute of Neurophysiological Psychology. It's based out of the UK, which is where a lot of the primitive reflex training and stuff is. And so they actually have a satellite school in Miami, so I didn't have to go to the UK. I went to Florida to do my post-grad work. They have a really cool school. But I got into all of that because of my cousin, Jack. So he had a lot of different developmental delays, a lot of different diagnoses. His mom had tried all of the traditional stuff and all of the non-traditional stuff. And she finally found a lady in Thornton named Anna Buck, who was a neurodevelopmental delay therapist. And she started working with him, and within just a few months, we could all see big changes in him, in his personality, in his emotion regulation, in his awareness and social skills. And she worked with him for a long time and really transformed his life. And so I got to watch that when I was a young teenager. I think I was 13 or 14 when he went through. and it made a pretty big impact on me. And I knew from that really young age that this was something that I wanted to do. And so I started studying it in college. And then when I was in my senior year of college, I got to come to Colorado. I was in Oklahoma at the time. I got to come to Colorado and intern with Anna. And one of the things that I learned through that process was how important pregnancy and birth are to these types of early development. And so one of the things that she was talking about for helping to prevent this type of thing is midwifery care and really good prenatal care, really good care during pregnancy and birth, and really good care during the early postpartum period. And so that's when I started getting really interested in pregnancy and birth stuff. I became a doula when I was in college, and I worked as a doula for a little while. But then once I got out of college, I really wanted to learn more about the medical side of things. So doulas just do a lot of comfort measures and emotional support. And I wanted more of the medical background. So I started a 2-year program in Oklahoma for certified midwives assistants. And so I did that for a while. And then during that time, I also did my post-grad degree in the neurodevelopmental delay. And then I opened a practice in 2016, and I was in Oklahoma for a little bit before I moved out here. And I've been working out here with these kids ever since, and I love it.
Yay. Awesome. What an awesome introduction, and what a cool story of you see firsthand when you're learning things. I'm sure it's so fun to learn it because you're like, oh, that's why this happened, or now I understand seeing your cousin go through things or other kids. So
Yeah.
We're glad you're here, and you're in Castle Rock, right?
Yes, I'm in Castle Rock.
Perfect. Awesome. Okay, so first question is, what are primitive reflexes? What do you mean that? For people who, I think people on right here now that I see, at least in the comments, do know, but people watching this might not. So definitely explain, what are primitive reflexes?
So babies that are born at term are all born with a set of reflexes that they should keep within the first year or so. And there's a whole bunch of them. And these reflexes are all really important because babies come out kind of undercooked neurologically. They're really immature when they're born. And so they rely on reflexes to help them survive during that early infancy period. They rely on these reflexes to help them with the birth process and to help them develop all sorts of brain and body skills that they will need later on. So there are reflexes that help develop eye movements, they help develop body coordination and awareness, they help with breathing, and all of these reflexes should be present for anywhere from 4 to 12 months after birth, depending on which ones you're talking about. And then they should integrate or disappear. And that process of them being present and then integrating helps to develop a lot of other parts of the brain. So the eyes develop, the vestibular system develops, which we can talk a little bit more about later. And all of these different systems develop. And then we get adult reflexes that we keep that help us with posture, with eye movements, with body coordination. But there are a lot of things that can happen during pregnancy, during the birth process in particular, and then during those early infant stages that prevent those reflexes from integrating properly. There are things that can happen during pregnancy that prevent them from developing properly. Babies that are born premature often have underdeveloped reflexes. Any sort of major sickness, illness, obviously things like drug or alcohol abuse, but even certain prescription medications, things like that, stress during pregnancy, all of those things impact the way that neurological system develops. And then same thing with birth. So complications that happen during the birth process, even things that we consider kind of normal for birth, like cesarean deliveries or forcep or vacuum deliveries, inductions, anytime babies get real distressed or have any injuries from the birth process, all of that has an impact on them neurologically. And some of those things affect different reflexes. And then in infancy, if babies struggle and have problems with their infant period, really high fevers, bad reactions to medications or vaccinations, really intense sicknesses or traumas. I work with a lot of adopted kids, a lot of kids that got separated from mom at or shortly after birth, a lot of trauma that happened in those early stages. All of that is going to have a neurological impact on these reflexes and these early brain development period. So when that happens, kids can get kind of stuck neurologically. So it affects the way that lots of other parts of their brain develop. It affects the way their eyes develop. It affects the way their vestibular system develops. It affects the way their fight or flight response develops. And so you can have a lot of kids that get stuck in these early stages of development or have a lot of issues with the way that their brain functions as they get older. And a lot of times parents and care providers don't realize how far back these issues have stemmed. So you'll have a child that's school age, that's struggling in school, that's struggling with emotion regulation, that's got sensory issues or social issues. And a lot of people don't realize that those things can have started way back in pregnancy, early infancy stage. And so that's what I'm looking at, is all those early parts of brain development.
Okay. That's a great explanation. So if those things get missed, is that it? Does the body compensate, or what happens after that?
Well, if no treatment is done, then the body kind of copes, and kids develop in different ways and they figure out how to cope with what they've got. But that doesn't have to happen. A lot of what I do in my practice is I work with kids that have all those types of delays. So I take them through different physical therapies that target different parts of their brain and those different body systems, so that we can kind of recapture those earlier stages of development. And it's kind of an extensive process. It takes a lot of work to go back through and develop a whole neurological system that got stuck early on, especially when you're dealing with kids that have a lot of trauma or a lot of early, negative early childhood experiences. They have a lot to work through, but they're not stuck. I mean, we can definitely help.
That's awesome. And how do you know which ones are needed or what you go back on? Is there a particular order? Like, how does that assessment work?
Yeah, so when families come in, I assess a lot of different reflexes. There's actually hundreds of reflexes, but not hundreds that affect later development. And so there's probably about 20 reflexes that I look at that affect the way we process emotions, the way we process sensory information, that affect our understanding of left and right and up and down and things like that. So there's a lot that affect school, a lot that affect emotions, a lot that affect social development. And those are the ones that I'm looking at. And then I also look at a bunch of different body systems that connect to those. So one of the big things that I spend a lot of time working on is the vestibular system. So that is this little apparatus, it's in your ear, that tells you where you are in space and what your head is doing and what your body is doing. And it really connects with a bunch of different other systems in the brain and the body to give us stable perception of our environment. So when our vestibular system is off, it can throw off our entire understanding of our own body and our environment. And so that one system alone can affect emotion regulation, it can affect social understanding, it affects body awareness, it affects academic performance, because anytime your perception is off, it can impact lots of different areas. So that's a big thing that I look at. And most kids that have primitive reflexes also have vestibular stuff too. Those are two systems that are really closely connected in the brain at the brainstem, which is the real low level or the lowest level of the brain. And then I look at eye movements. So most kids who have reflexes also have problems with the way that their eyes can move. And so things like tracking and convergence and all of these eye movements that you need for school, most of these kids their eyes don't work for them. So it's a struggle to force their eyes to function. And they can't see well enough to get their schoolwork done. So I look at all of those different systems, and then depending on what's working and what's not, we make a plan for each child to start at whatever the earliest point is. So each of these reflexes kind of develop and inhibit in a very specific order in infancy. And so we always start back at whatever that earliest point is and work up there. So we're doing what we call working developmentally, where we are working in the order that the brain is supposed to develop in. And the reason that we do that is, one, because it is way more effective. You can't really just jump around and integrate reflexes very well, especially when kids have a lot that's going on. And almost all of the kids that I work with have a retained startle reflex. It's called the Moro, which is our infant fight or flight response. And that is one of the earliest reflexes to develop, and it causes a lot of problems with the way that we process emotions, the way that we process sensory information. It affects our arousal and attention and things like that. And so for most kids, that's where we're starting, and we have to get their body kind of physiologically stable before we can even work on other things later on too.
Okay.
So that's how we figure out the plan for what we're working on for each child.
And we've talked about this. So if that Moro reflex, the startle reflex, is in place, does that mean all the reflexes after them have not been integrated, or can they sometimes get some integration? But so I understand when you're working on it, you go from the beginning before it. But if they miss that first one, does that mean all the other ones aren't integrated too, or do they get some of them?
No, not necessarily. You can have a startle reflex and then not have some of the later ones. You can have infant reflexes and also still have some of the adult reflexes. So typically, as those infant reflexes go away, the adult reflexes come in. But some kids, their brains are able to cope with it, and they can work through some of the reflexes, but get stuck with some of the others. That's also one of the reasons why we work developmentally, is because a lot of times integrating that Moro reflex will have a domino effect in those other areas, and we won't have to work on some of those other reflexes. Their brain will just kind of take off with it.
Yeah, because it's not stuck there anymore.
Yeah. And kids can be very different. So one of the things that we talk about a lot in our, with the other therapists that do this, is how many retained startle reflexes we see. We see a lot of kids with retained Moros, but they can look different from child to child. So I get some kids that come in the office that are really anxious and withdrawn and fearful and nervous kids. They don't want to be away from mom. They're scared of everything. They get overloaded really easily, and then they shut down. I get other kids that have a startle reflex that are very angry and rough and physical and hyper, that are more on that side of things. And I get some kids that are both, that will react different ways in different situations. Some kids develop a lot of OCD-like tendencies. Some kids develop a lot of physical side effects for things like that, a lot of digestive issues, a lot of immune issues, a lot of all of that physiological stress gets turned inward. And so you see that a lot in the body, and you may see it a little bit less in the emotions. So every child is different, even if they have some of the same reflexes. So you really, when working to integrate those, you also have to kind of keep that in mind, is how each of these kids is functioning and what they need for support. That's one of the ways that I kind of found you, Amy, is you do a lot of the nutritional stuff. And that is a huge support for kids that have a lot of those physical reactions to that fight or flight response.
Yeah, that is, again, Well, not why we connected, but definitely one of the main things I learned, because I know that fight or flight affects digestion and impairs tons of things. And I have a question about the vestibular connection with like hypothalamus and pituitary, but hold on, let me finish my thought.
Okay.
And that would be, yeah, we've talked about that. And the nutrition can support and create an environment that's more stress tolerant. The organs feel that they're well nourished and able to handle stuff. But if there's still a perception issue where they're perceiving things are more stressful, sure, you have the ability to handle that stress and you may not even feel anxious, but your body's still working harder than it would have to work if your sensory or your perception of the world was more accurate.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, diet, and we've talked about this with different mutual clients, that diet can really support and almost not hide, but it can be a little trickier to see because on first look, they may seem better, but you still can dig in and integrate that. And all of a sudden, wow, their life just got a whole bunch easier still. And their body, in my view, can now turn attention towards another thing that needs healing because it doesn't have to keep compensating in that way. So I see healing actually happen faster once that reflex is integrated, even if it wasn't an obvious problem before.
Yeah. Yeah, I see a lot of funky things with nutrition, and that's one of the things that is kind of a red flag for Amoro to me is families that have done a ton of nutrition stuff. They've done a lot of gut healing stuff, and it makes a big difference, but then they always have to keep going back to it. There's all like the body doesn't heal and then move on. It heals and then constantly needs that support. That to me is a red flag that something else is underlying that cause. And not that you shouldn't do the nutritional stuff. Obviously, that support is necessary and amazing, but that there's probably something else that could help them too. And I see a lot of kids that have those nutritional and not just dietary, but a lot of immune allergy stuff, a lot of immune responses to things, even as much as food related stuff. And once we start to integrate those reflexes, all of a sudden their body can actually heal from it and doesn't need all of that constant support. And they can, and I'm sure too that with the people that you see, that they have other things physically that they need to work on too, and that the body needs to be able to devote some energy to. And it's tough.
But it has to maintain that, right? Survival has to be ensured, so it can't move on to other stages of growth or wisdom or logical thinking. Even when we're stuck in fear, we're stuck in fear. And so that definitely is a huge, I've seen it be, especially with a few kids that we've shared, I've just seen a huge difference happen all of a sudden with that. They were doing amazing on their diet and all of a sudden something shifted. So really
yeah, I see that a lot with emotions and academics too, is like even kids that they can make it academically, like they can get the grades that they need, they can do all the things that they need to do to function, but they're not in any sort of growth. They're just maintaining. And eventually you can't maintain like that forever. And just because somebody can function at a certain level also doesn't mean that it's optimal for them. And then a lot of kids I work with can't function at all. And they're there because none of those things are working even a little bit. But
so one question we had talked about is back to on our outline, primitive reflexes, how they connect together. Did you describe that in the way that you wanted to talk about how we talked about what they are. Did you talk about how they connect?
So one of the things that I tell families when I send them their report, because I'll send them a report that has like all the different reflexes and all the different systems, and they're kind of broken down, into all these separate pieces. But the reality is you have to look at the whole neurological system as a whole. So all of these reflexes connect to one another. They connect to all these different brain systems, all these different body systems. And so rarely, do you want to look at one thing or the other? So if they have 6 reflexes, we're not doing 6 different things or 6 different problems. It's all like one big system that's not working right. And so, and basically what I'm looking at are all of the different systems that connect to the brainstem and the cerebellum, which are the 2 lowest parts of the brain. So the brainstem is the one that's responsible for the infant reflexes. It's also what connects the brain to the rest of the body. So there's a lot of different body systems that all meet at that same area of the brain. So the eyes have connections there, the vestibular system has connections there. Every nerve that comes through your body has connections there. And so when one or more of those is off, it throws off all of our connection from our brain to our body. And so really, when I'm looking at kids, I'm not as concerned about the individual reflexes or the individual systems. I'm concerned as a whole how all of these things are functioning together to provide this child with what they need or not in the cases of the kids coming in.
Okay.
Did that answer your question?
Yeah, that's perfect. That's great. Yeah, you talked a little bit about connecting in terms of integrating here and there, or you miss these and you might have trouble with these. But yeah, I thought that you had mentioned a bigger connection. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. And then you had a question about the vestibular system.
Yeah. So I have on my organ relationship sheet that I have up here on the wall, I know that hypothalamus and pituitary glands are the master glands that then tell the rest of the endocrine organs how to function. And so what I talk to my people a lot is, hey, if something like a head injury happens and your hypothalamus gland above your palate gets bumped, you potentially can perceive the world as more stressful. And then it tells everyone else below it to respond in stress, even though there's not actually stress. So it's very similar to what you're talking about that vestibular function. And I was just curious if they just do similar things, which is fine, or if there's a connection between them that you know about.
I don't know. I don't know of a connection, but I know that there's not a lot of people that study the vestibular system in a really low level way. Like most of the time when I talk to people about the vestibular system, it's way more about the ear and less about the brain connection to that. And so like even a lot of OTs and people that do a lot of vestibular work, they do a lot of like real fast vestibular work where they do a lot of spinning and a lot of stimulation of the vestibular system, but not a lot of like actual changes to the way that the vestibular system and the brain communicate. So I kind of think of it like hearing versus auditory processing. So a lot of people study like how that functions and just kind of like how you hear, but not necessarily how that connects.
Right. How does it go to your brain?
Yes, I think at least from what I see with my kiddos, I think that the vestibular system is like one of the biggest keys to understanding our perception of our environment and our world. And my guess is there's probably connections between that system and lots of other parts of the brain and body that we just don't really know about yet because it hasn't been studied yet. So it wouldn't surprise me at all. But that's very theoretical, you know?
Well, it makes sense. And like you said, when I started really studying the Bible, we do know a lot about physical functionality of the Bible, or the body, sorry. That's very other B word of the body. It's very known. You know, we know this happens and it hits the little sensor things. My words are gone. It was a long day, and that triggers, and then the sound goes into the nerve, right? But that's all you talk about. How does the signal get to you? We don't really talk about how do you understand and communicate an emotion by hearing a word that was spoken and you feel an emotion because we have no idea how that works. No one's studying that. Same with everything. You feel a touch on your hand and it's someone that you are scared of or it's someone that you love, and that touch sends a different signal. You know, like we have no understanding of the hormonal, maybe are the like chemical messengers between body and spirit, or like no one studies that, at least in our culture, which is I think there's a huge amount of helpfulness if we work to connect those things. But it's hard. I get why not, because it's hard. It's not even maybe
it seems like, at least in the US, the way that people study medicine and the body and these things is all like in their own little specialty or bubble or box, and not a lot of like communication or connection between the different areas. And if you're dealing physically, you deal physically. If you're doing physiology, you do physiology. If you're doing emotional stuff, you do emotional stuff. And they're all the part of the same system. And so it's hard to find people that really understand all of those connections. But I think it's important. And the more that I work with kids and see, the more I realize how little we know about things.
Yeah.
So.
And thankfully, we just have to know what helps and the body figures it out. So that's good.
Yes, actually, it is kind of amazing because the body's way smarter than me when it comes to this stuff. So that's what I tell parents sometimes, is there's a lot of art to this. There's a lot of science, but there's a lot of art to it. And sometimes you just got to try something and let the kids, let them tell you what they need, and pay attention to what their brains and bodies are telling you about those things.
Yes. Yeah. I had a struggle with that idea that the body's smart for a little while, but then I like wanted to know it, but it just seemed like a little bit too esoteric to me, just because I actually love studying emotions and mental. But someone said this and it made sense. Your body has to know where everything is and what's happened in history, in terms of nutritional status. So intuitive eating is not a crazy thought, because if your body didn't know, you'd be dead in 5 minutes. Like there's no way between the acid-base balancing and the nutritional balancing and the beating of your heart. Like if your body didn't know everything going on in you, you would be dead. It does know it. And that just really helped me go, oh, okay, this is not some high spiritual concept that I need to like cautious, like physically, the body has to know. It has to coordinate somehow, and we don't know how to do that either.
Yeah.
It coordinates, but which is fine. We don't need to know. We just need to know it's doing the best it can. Can we help it do better? Where can we enter in and offer support? And it will do what it can, and then you come in the next helping step whenever that becomes apparent.
Yeah.
So, do you see Bonnie's question here? So Bonnie she does something similar to you, different qualifications. mRNA. Sorry, Bonnie, you can tell what it is, but so she is, I think, asking as more of a colleague question of like, how much time do you find your
she asked, how much time do you find parents realistically needing to spend working with their kids each week? So what I have them do is one exercise. We start off with one. Maybe later in the program we'll end up doing two, but for the most part we do one exercise every day at night before they go to bed, and they take anywhere from 2 to 10 minutes a night. So it's very short, small exercises. And what I tell families is that they're very potent and they're very stimulating. And so we want to do just the tiniest little bit that we can very regularly. So what is most important to integrate these is the consistency, is that their brain and body are getting what they need very regularly, and that you're not doing too much. So I've found that especially in the beginning, when we're working on Moro stuff or when we're working on vestibular stuff, that less is more. And that if you try to do too much or push the body too much, kids get overstimulated and the body starts to shut down. And when you're talking about integrating a startle response, that is your body's response to trauma, and it is your body's survival instinct, and you cannot just power through it. You cannot just like have a rough month and force your way through it. You have to be really gentle, and the body has to know that it's safe and able to start moving on and maturing. So the actual therapy itself is very small and very consistent.
Awesome. Great. Thank you. I wanted, if you could talk a little bit about eye movements. I feel like the two things that I see, well, emotional regulation. I'd love for you to talk maybe a few more minutes about that. And then eye movements. So maybe eye movements is a little shorter topic, maybe. I do tracking when I remember in my well children visit, especially around that elementary school age, to see where we're at. And I do see that the eyes will jump. They'll not quite track smoothly. They'll guess where you're going, or they like come back to center. So I'm assuming you're talking about that. Are you also talking about nearsighted, farsighted? Some people who have like the eye muscle is shortened. Is that a nerve? Tell me about eye stuff that you know about.
Okay. So the eye screening that I do, what I tell families is it's a very basic rudimentary screening. So I check tracking, I check hand-eye tracking, I check convergence, and I check accommodation. I check a few other eye-related things, but those are kind of the big ones. And so tracking is basically the ability to follow something that's moving smoothly. Hand-eye tracking is the ability to coordinate your eyes and your hand to follow something that's moving. Convergence is the ability for your two eyes to kind of fuse together to see one stable image, so that because each eye receives a different image and then your brain has to make one out of it. So we're wanting to make sure that that happens smoothly. And then accommodation is the ability to move from something to converge on something that's closer and then smoothly move and converge on something that's further away. So to jump back and forth between the two. And the biggest thing that I see is that there's a reflex called the ATNR reflex. It's the asymmetric tonic neck reflex. And it's one where when the head turns to the side, the arm and leg, you can't really see me, but the arm and leg on whatever side you're facing extend, and the arm and leg on the other side flex. And this is one of the reflexes that I see pretty commonly in a lot of kids. And it's one that causes a lot of academic problems. One of the reasons is because it affects tracking. So when this reflex is present in early infancy, it is helping to train the tracking and the hand-eye coordination. So while it's present, there's kind of this invisible connection between the head, the eyes, and the hand, so that whatever the head's doing, the eyes and the hand are connected and wanting to follow. It also creates this kind of invisible barrier at the midline of the body, so that kids have a hard time integrating the two sides of their body. So they have a hard time crossing their midline effectively. They have a hard time separating their left and right effectively. And you see that a lot with eye movements. So when I'm looking at tracking, I see a lot of kids whose eyes jump. So as soon as they start to follow something, it'll bounce. Especially over the midline or the midpoint of each of the sides. I see a lot of kids that will track with their head or their body. I see a lot of kids that as soon as they start tracking, they get off balance, so they start kind of wiggling around. I see kids that will tense up and hold their breath to try to like force their body to not move while their eyes are tracking. And those things are very closely connected to that ATNR reflex. In fact, eye movements are one of the ways that I evaluate and see to make sure that that reflex is integrating properly. So when families come in, we talk about symptom-wise what's going on, and then I retest some of the reflexes. I retest balance and coordination stuff that are affected by reflexes, and then I also retest the eye movements to make sure that all of those things are coming together. So not just is the reflex going away, but is that also stimulating growth in the eye movements? And then I see a lot of kids that have some funky eye movements that are related to that startle response. So kids that are very visually distracted, they're what we call stimulus bound, where their eyes jump to any little changes in the environment. And so we might be tracking, and every time the pencil goes by my face, they get distracted by my face. Or if there's a noise outside, or if there's movement in the room, their eyes jump to that movement. And I even have kids that get really frustrated and try really hard not to make that happen. And I mean, that's not a behavioral thing. That's their brain, it jumps to whatever it is. And that is very closely connected to that moro. So in infancy, when babies have that startle reflex and should, that's what their vision does. Their vision is very peripheral. So it's constantly moving to the edges of their visual field. It's constantly moving to anything that's high contrast or moving. They're very, like they like to look at faces. And about the same time that startle reflex goes away, their vision becomes more central. And so we tune out a lot of that extra visual information, and our brain just alerts us to the things that it should alert us to, and kind of tunes out a lot. Most of the kids that I work with cannot tune anything out. They are very visually distracted. And so even if tracking is okay, they still have a hard time focusing their vision, which affects school, and affects a lot of different areas of life.
Okay. Awesome. That's really great. So in terms of emotional regulation, I often have conversations with parents for various reasons about the emotions that their kids are having and how it's not their parenting failure, but it's something going on, either blood sugar issues or nutritional deficiencies or not enough minerals for the nervous system to be calm, or reflexes. And I can't talk as much about that beyond just I know it affects it. So I'd love to hear you say a little bit more about what kind of things are not normal that parents are passing off as normal because they just, they're taking to heart that they're just a bad parent.
Yeah.
When it's something the child is doing.
Yeah. So most of the time, the biggest contributor to emotions is a retained startle reflex. Also some vestibular stuff. But one of the big things that we haven't really talked about is that the infant startle reflex is much more sensitive and much stronger than the adult startle reflex. So kids live in a world that is too loud and too bright and too busy for them. And physiologically, their body responds and overreacts to their environment. So what I tell families is their stress cup is just full. And so they might be happy and do okay some of the time, but then a little bit gets added to it and it's too much. And emotions look very different from child to child. So the things that are kind of red flags and concerning to me are kids that just melt down a lot. They just are really over emotional all the time. To me, that's something in the body that's going on that's not right. It could be related to sleep. It could be nutrition. It could be life is hard at the moment and family stuff's going on, or it could be that physiologically and neurologically they don't have what they need to regulate that, and that they're just always on the verge of being overloaded. And kind of like I mentioned before, when you have kids that have a lot of dietary support, that have a lot of stress and calm families, and a lot of emotional support that still melt down a lot, that's a big concern that neurologically, that even with support, they're not really getting what they need. Also, kids that require all of those things a lot of the times, that's kind of a sign that the body doesn't have what it needs. Usually what I see that's concerning with emotional stuff is there's also sensory things that come along with it. So getting overloaded by noises or lights or textures or crowds or commotion. And then things even like hyperactivity. So some kids, when they go into a fight or flight response, will get really hyper and wound up and excitable. And what's happening is that their body is under a stress response, but it feels better to be hyper and wound up and excited than to be anxious or afraid. And so that's a concern. Kids that get really, really angry and kind of shut down. So really angry and can't verbalize why, can't control it, especially when they start saying after, like, I don't want to be that angry and I don't know what to do about it, or my body is angry and I don't know why, and things like those are the types of things that I hear kids say a lot. And most kids know, and they realize that something's off, that they're not matching the situation. And a lot of kids try hard to control those things because nobody wants to feel that way. And I think it's easy to kind of label that as a behavioral thing or something that's going on, but really, for the most part, those big emotional reactions are not within somebody's control. And if it seems like it's out of hand, there's probably something going on that's underlying those things.
Awesome. And then you mentioned sleep, which can play into behaviors, but also cannot be affected by reflexes, sleep.
Oh yeah. I see funky things with sleep too. Most of the time what I see is that when we're going through this program, kids need a lot more sleep,
Okay.
which makes sense because their body's healing.
Yep.
And
Like
we
being a
need sleep.
baby again.
Yeah. And I have a lot of kids. I actually have one that just started who's struggled with sleep his whole life. And we started, and within 2 days of starting his exercise, he's sleeping through the night.
Oh my goodness.
So, I mean, those are big changes. Like, obviously, if he's not getting enough sleep too, his body is not recovering and healing
Right.
well. So I'm always happy when kids are sleeping, and I always tell families, don't wake them up if you can help it. Just
Right.
let them get the extra sleep that they need,
Yeah.
because they're healing.
And that's so helpful to know, because sometimes I've had some tough sleep cases and just can't quite figure it out. And I didn't even think about that being a reflex issue potentially. So,
I mean, it could be if that was the only thing that was going on. That's not what would be my first thought,
yeah, but when
obviously.
I've done a year or two of stuff and they just can't sleep and
Yeah.
you can't figure out why, that's helpful to know that may be their main symptom. They're not overly emotional or struggling with school, but maybe what's affecting is the sleep.
Well, and I go on and on about that startle reflex, but it
Yeah.
affects our whole arousal system. And so it affects sleep, it affects awareness, it affects awakeness. And so when that system is off, it can affect the way that the whole body regulates those things.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. So if parents are noticing, like, what's the age of kids that you work with? Like, how early? When do you know that the body's not doing what it needs to? Can you kind of preemptively help the body so that you don't have developmental problems later? Like, what do you usually work with, and what do other people usually work with in terms of age?
So I start with kids. I can start as early as 3.5 or 4, all the way up through adulthood. The reason I can't start younger is because the program that I'm trained in isn't not really designed to evaluate or treat that way. Although I wish that somebody, and maybe there are people that I don't know about, was studying how to start that, because I have a few families who have, excuse me, younger kids, and I know that at some point they're going to need it. And I'm always kind of a proponent of, if you can start earlier, you should start earlier.
Yeah.
I just am not quite sure how to help those. So what I tell families for younger and smaller kids is all sorts of supportive stuff. So nutrition, chiropractic care, like lowering stress, things like that, just to help support them. Lots of time on the floor if they're babies, lots of time crawling, lots of physical activities, limiting screen time, things like that can all be very helpful and supportive. And some kids will work through some of that stuff on their own. And some kids may be a little bit behind at a year or a year and a half, but they may catch up with the right support in those early stages. So I don't work on those, but I would love to know anybody that does,
Yeah.
because there are kids that need it for sure.
Awesome. And then, is there an age limit of working on these reflexes?
No, I mean, you can work on them in adults too. I prefer working with kids because they're easier. It's difficult. The challenges with working with adults is that you need somebody to help you through the process. So a lot of the exercises require another person. And adults, I require that they see a counselor at the same time if we're going to do it, because there's a lot of things that pop up. And adults still have to function. Kids can have a rough week and stay home from school and go see mom, and have a little bit of a hard time, and adults still have to
function
to live day to day. And so a counselor can kind of help them monitor through the process. But I work with a lot of teenagers, and I work with a lot of young adults that are still at home, so that are not, either they're not ready to move out or they haven't yet. And there doesn't seem to be any issue integrating things at that age, if if you've got the right family support there.
Okay.
So which is good to know, because I know with there's a lot of thought out there with brain development stuff that you reach a certain age and you can't do anything about it. And I very much disagree with that thought.
I disagree with that thought in any aspect. I think that our body is designed to heal and improve, and the only reason it hasn't is because it can't yet.
Yeah.
And so if we give it the opportunities, if we change what's coming in, and when you look at the medical world, they can't improve things because they don't acknowledge nutrition, for example. They acknowledge this kind of connection. Their toolbox is very limited, and medications only band-aid things. They often inhibit the body's ability to heal or change or fix. And if you don't change nutrition or the way the nervous system is talking, you can't change it. So from their perspective, they're right, but also they're wrong. So
yes, I just avoid any statements of any hard statements about this can't be done or this can't be healed, because I've seen some kids that were stuck in this spot forever, and that's not true at all.
Yeah.
I just disagree with that completely. You just don't know how to do it, is what you should say.
Right. I don't know how to do that yet. Perfect. Okay. I wondered, Bonnie, you guys should connect, you and Emily, because
I see some things coming up in chat. I will message or email you, Bonnie, because I'm interested in learning about that MNRI.
Yeah. And that would be great. Well, maybe we'll get Bonnie in to talk about babies and stuff. On a later class, maybe next month, probably next month or something. We'll talk, Bonnie, but that would be great, because that support of how do we keep it from becoming a problem, and then parents, you get 2 resources for you. So that's awesome.
Yeah. All of the prevention that I know stops around the time midwifery care ends. So I have a lot of training in prevention when you're talking about pregnancy, when you're talking about birth process, when you're talking about those early stages. But the schooling that I did is not designed for those babies, and I think that's an important step too. So I'll look into that.
In terms of birth process and midwifery, how do you help people with that? Or what are resources that moms who are pregnant right now watching this, how could they learn about what to do to set up their babies the best?
Okay, so there's a lot of different books that I love that they would be a good start with to kind of dip their toe in. I mean, I could flood people with resources and information, but
we could put maybe some of your favorite ones in the description of this video. So if you want to email me, and I'll update that when I get it, and we'll get those links to books or other videos or whatever you've got to give you.
Yeah. So one of them I'll mention is by a lady named Sally Goddard Blythe. She is one of the founders of the institute that I got my post-grad degree at. And she wrote a ton of books, and they are all fantastic resources. But she has one called What Babies and Children Really Need. And it starts from conception on through childhood. And she just starts to highlight a lot of the different needs in each of those stages, and how to support moms during pregnancy, and how to support babies during that time, and then how to support kids. And so that's a great book that kind of gives a broad general overview for some of those things. And then if parents are interested in kind of diving more into specific topics, that's great. And then my other favorite resource is APA, which is the Association of Prenatal and Perinatal Psychology and Health. It's basically everything birth meets psychology, everything pregnancy, birth meets mental health. And they have a ton of resources for moms, mostly pregnancy, birth, really, and early postpartum time period. But they work internationally with a lot of different research companies or research groups. They have an actual medical journal that they put out and publish research, and then they have resources all over the world. And what I like is that they have a lot of different, it's not, even though it's based out of the US, it is not very Western.
Awesome.
So they have a lot of resources and connections in a lot of different areas. And that is the absolute best place to start if you're pregnant or wanting to become pregnant or anything like that.
What are the initials of that?
APPPAH. If you Google birth psychology, that's kind of their tagline. They'll come up, and they have courses, they have books, they have conferences. They had a big international conference in Denver about 2 years ago that was amazing. I got to go speak at it, and they had people who traveled from all over the world to come speak and come visit, and it was awesome. So they have a ton of resources.
Awesome. Wow, that's great. Okay, looking through, I think we covered everything that we had talked about. One thing I just wanted to give people kind of to close up, if they want to work with you, just walk them through how to do that, what the process is, so that they don't have to go research it. You can just tell them if they want to work with you, what does that look like?
So probably the easiest way would be to go to my website, which is earlyrootstherapy.com. And I have all my contact information there. So if you want to call me or email me, you can do that. I also have a questionnaire, a screening questionnaire that parents can fill out if they are wanting to know whether or not this would be a good fit for their kid. And it asks a lot of questions ranging from basically from pregnancy all the way through present day. And that's the tool that I use to screen and see what kids would be good candidates for the program or not. And what I typically do is if parents fill that questionnaire out, then we set up a phone call to kind of walk through it, because I always have more questions and I always want to hear like more than just the questions. I want to kind of hear from the parents what's going on and how their kids are doing. And then usually based on just that phone call and questionnaire, we can figure out whether or not they could benefit from this. If for some reason they're kind of questionable, or if I'll work with a lot of adopted kids and families can't fill out that information. So if we can't figure that out, then they can come in for a short little screening assessment where I just check a couple of things just to make sure before we, do the whole evaluation and get started.
Mm-hmm.
So,
okay.
But if you want, families are always just welcome to call me or email me if they want more information. And my website has a lot of information on it too.
Awesome. Perfect. And then when you see people, how often, like if they're far away from Castle Rock, how often would they need to drive to see you?
So after the first assessment, or the initial assessment where we look at everything and we start the program, I like to see families 1 month after that. And then follow-ups we see every 2 months. Okay. And I can do all of it online. I prefer to do the initial assessment in person because I feel like it's more beneficial. But I have families that I work with internationally that can't. And so we kind of make do. But if they're local or within several hours, I highly recommend coming in. But follow-up visits we can do remotely, decently easy. And so I have a lot of families that live 4 or 5 hours away. And so they'll come in for that initial assessment. And then every 2 months, we just do follow-up online. And if I feel like we need to evaluate something in person, then they can come in. But it does, the nice thing about the program is it's not like other therapies where you have to come in a lot. Right. And so it can be a little bit more affordable for families, because I know therapeutic services can get really expensive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so. And they do all the work at home.
Yeah.
But most of the work. You do a lot of work too.
Well, they do more.
Thank you so much, Emily, for being here. Yeah. If anyone has any questions, we'll just chit chat for a minute. If anyone wants to type something in that had a question they were waiting, it takes 15 seconds for your question to get to us. So type fast and we will just take a minute or two to do that. Yeah, definitely there's huge resources, and Emily is one of those, and I appreciate knowing her for all these years. And Emily, all that you've done to care for the kids that I care about, that I've sent to you.
Yeah.
So for that. And I don't know what else. I'm just trying to kill time for a second while we're seeing if there's questions that come in.
Well, I appreciate you having me on, Amy. This has been awesome. And I've really enjoyed getting to know you. I know that you've helped a lot of families, and I'm excited to see what else comes.
Yeah, I'm glad to get this information out in a place that I already have thought when you've said different things about multiple families of, oh, things I couldn't say or I didn't maybe know fully, and I can just send them the link to this video and get that your information and wisdom into their understanding for them to evaluate, is this good for their kids? So I'm excited to have
Awesome.
this recorded. It's great.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah, and everyone please share, like it. That helps. Subscribe helps just with the algorithms. We're little, but you know, we're gonna get bigger. So on YouTube here. And I'm not seeing any questions coming in. Any final closing thoughts, Emily?
Nope, I think that's about it. Thank you, guys.
Hey, thanks everyone. We're right at an hour, and we will see you all in May, I guess, is our last April one. So we'll get a newsletter out soon with the next 2 classes.